I have actually just got over a very, very bad flu, so during this video, if I seem quite tired and lethargic, it's because I am. However, the Mad Lads must continue. Serial killers very often work in the shadows, only striking in the dead of night, and their targets are usually solo hitchhikers or lone wanderers because doing things that way helps to avoid witnesses and it prevents them from getting caught. But the person that we're going to talk about today had an entire state terrified because when he struck completely unseen in broad daylight in front of lots of witnesses, sometimes right in the middle of a busy street. And despite this, the police still couldn't catch him, and thousands of people were too scared to even leave their homes because they could be next. The Washington Sniper. Please leave a like and a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. But before we get into the video, we actually have a new sponsor, World of Warships. World of Warships is a free-to-play game for the PC with over 44 million players worldwide. The game has beautiful maps and unique living landscapes with stunning graphics and even weather changes during battle. Each warship needs a naval commander to lead it into battle, and there are many commanders to choose from, including over 10 iconic historical figures. The game also features over 400 historical ships that you can control, and each ship is designed based on historical documents and actual blueprints from the first half of the 20th century. There are 5 different classes, which include destroyers, battleships, cruisers, aircraft carriers, and submarines. So you have plenty to choose from. There are always new events and missions to play in World of Warships. Imagine playing as Godzilla or Kong as a commander of your ship, or the incredible characters from the Azure Lane or battles against giant monsters from Big Hunt. These are some of the previous collaborations in World of Warships. So if you want to play World of Warships, then you can click the link down in the description, and during registration use the promo code FIRE to get a free 200 doubloons, 1 million credits, a tier 5 USS Texas, and 20 Restless Fire Camouflage, and also 7 days of premium account access. New sponsor. Show them some love. Click the link. Before we talk about the event, we need to mention what led up to it, especially when it concerns the youngest of the two perpetrators in this story. Born on the 18th of February 1985 in Kingston, Jamaica, Lee Boyd Malvo's childhood was very rough. He and his family lived in complete poverty aside from the roof over their heads. On top of that, he was abused by his mother, and she was overly demanding of him, despite him being too young to achieve what she expected of him. If he ever messed up for something as simple as not doing one of his chores, his mother would abandon him, sometimes for days and sometimes even weeks, and other times he didn't know if or when she would even be coming back at all. He started working from a very young age because he needed to feed himself and his mother just wasn't taking care of him. When she finally returned, she would often take him to live somewhere else, and a lot of the time this was because they were being hunted by debt collectors. This didn't only happen the one time, it happened many times over, to the point where Malvo felt so neglected that he tried to kill himself in hopes that his mother would feel some kind of sympathy for him. All he wanted in life was stability, and he saw that in father figures and teachers. Other parents at the time noticed that Malvo would become very, very attached to older men since he was so desperate for a father figure. This brings us to the main person in our story. John Allen Williams, who was born in New Orleans and changed his last name to Muhammad in the 80s after converting to Islam. He was 24 years older than Malvo and became someone who Malvo would do anything for. As anyone could expect, John's childhood was also a very rough one because he was severely bullied by his entire family and also in school. So he felt like a black sheep even well into his adulthood. John was very affected by the death of his mother because they were very close. And things weren't looking good for John even much later in his life because his first marriage ended in failure. But he didn't give up and eventually got married again to a woman named Mildred, and over the years they had 3 children together. Then John started working as a combat engineer for the National Guard, and things seemed to actually be really looking up for John. Everyone, including his friend Robert Holmes, who he met during a brief stint in the army at Fort Lewis, praised John on him being a great person and a great father. Robert described John as being a disciplinarian, but not in an abusive way. You know how when your mother says, "I'll tell your father when he gets back," and you would kind of go, fuck. You know, like that kind of way. John would never actually shout at his kids if they'd done something wrong. Instead, he would take them aside and calmly explain to them why what they did was wrong. John's family barber, Jerry O'Neill, who had known John and his family for over 11 years, thought that John's kids were very happy and very well mannered. So, none of the people who actually knew John ever saw him display any kind of anger or violence. Despite everything seeming like it was going well in John's life, he didn't like working in the National Guard, but he saw it as the best way of putting food on the table for his family. The one thing he hated was that the job itself pulled him away from them, and sometimes he was away from home for long periods of time. The only benefit of his job as a combat engineer was that John was highly trained in handling all kinds of weaponry, and he was especially skilled in sniper tactics.
Say the line, Bart!
In the business, we call this foreshadowing.
Yay!
John was then sent to fight in the First Gulf War as part of a squad that dismantled chemical warfare rockets. Some of you will know where this is going. Once John had returned home from the war, his family and friends started noticing small changes in his behaviour. At first it was subtle, but gradually it got a lot worse. John started to become very irritable and at times even shouted at people for very small things. Something that was completely out of character for him. People were starting to get very concerned at how angry John was becoming, how his personality seemed to have just totally changed. And in hindsight, there is some speculation that John was suffering from Gulf War syndrome, an affliction that had affected very many soldiers on both sides of the First Gulf War, due to them being exposed to a mixture of chemical weapons, nerve agents, depleted uranium, pesticides, and the bromide pills and anthrax vaccine that the soldiers were given to protect them from nerve agents and anthrax, because don't worry, they're totally safe. And the symptoms of Gulf War syndrome include things like chronic fatigue, chronic headaches, chronic muscle and joint pain, as well as memory problems and a wide array of neurological problems. So maybe Gulf War syndrome was the cause of certain events we're about to discuss. John started to become extremely disgruntled towards the United States and its military. This was during a time when soldiers weren't fully given adequate support and therapy after they had returned home. Things really haven't changed much since then. So John was all on his own when it came to dealing with all of the physical and mental trauma caused by the war. I am sure that many of you have heard stories about soldiers coming home with PTSD and then going on to do terrible things. So John had to let his anger out somehow, and unfortunately for his family, he started to take it out on his wife. He was no longer the man she had married. He would attack her randomly, one moment he would be completely fine, and the next moment he would snap for pretty much no reason. He even threatened to kill her. So, as you would expect, his wife grew to become absolutely terrified of John. So she left. As we mentioned earlier about John's childhood, he was a black sheep, and this made it very difficult for him to handle people rejecting him. John actually managed to keep custody of the kids, mostly because they were all he had left, but he also partly did it out of spite, because he was angry that his wife had left him, so he took full custody as a way of punishing her. Eventually, after spiralling further into his anger, John wanted to leave America. So he moved to the Caribbean island of Antigua, which meant taking his kids with him illegally. Legality, however, didn't matter too much to John at this point, because after he moved to the Caribbean, he took up a job forging illegal US travel documents, which earned him around $60,000 overall, mostly in forging US driver's licenses and birth certificates. John was apparently very good at this, as he could spot desperate and vulnerable targets very easily. So we have now covered the background of the two men involved in this story, and they both first met each other in 1999 through Malvo's mother. She wanted some forged documents so that she could go live in the United States, and for the rather hefty price of $3,000, John could make that happen. However, Malvo's mother could only afford her own documents. She didn't have enough for both her and Malvo. So the plan was the mother would use her own documents to go over to America, do some work and get the money together, and then have Malvo's documents made where he could then go over and join her. In the meantime, Malvo, who was also desperate for a father figure, would live with John. So we can all see where this is going. While all of this was happening, John's ex-wife Mildred was desperately trying to track down her kids. So she went to the police to file a missing persons report because she couldn't find them anywhere. The authorities then traced John to the Caribbean and got the local authorities to forcefully remove his kids and send them back to the United States. Then a court date was set up for a custody hearing. During the hearing, the court had absolutely no interest whatsoever in hearing John's side of the story. After all, he had essentially kidnapped the children and fled the country with them illegally. The hearing agreed that the kids should be placed into the custody of John's ex-wife. The ruling was seen as very biased by John and also John's friends, since the court pretty much completely refused to hear his side of the story. Another issue was, while the police were preparing to go over and take the kids back and take John by surprise, his ex-wife had filed all of the legal paperwork needed to gain custody of the kids. And since John was absolutely clueless as to what was about to happen, he had no time to prepare his own countersuit. He was completely unaware of what was going on until he was told by the judge in court. His ex-wife was also residing in a home which was in the United States, which gave her a major upper hand in the custody case. So John had pretty much nothing to fight back with. After the hearing, John was told that not only would he be granted zero custody of his own children, he was told he wasn't even allowed to visit them. This caused John to fall into a deep depression on top of his already failing mental health. John decided that he was going to fight back despite his odds being pretty much zero. He hired a family lawyer called John Mills, who described John as being a normal, concerned father, being completely unaware of what was brewing underneath. After the lawyer had explained what had happened in the hearing, John believed that everything could be fixed, but John was being idealistic, as his chances of seeing his kids were still extremely unlikely. However, one thing that lawyers are very well known for is getting your hopes up for unwinnable trials so they can still make their money. Now that John had lost his entire family, all he had left was Malvo. Malvo saw John as his father, but John saw Malvo as someone he could exploit. John didn't see him in the same way as he saw his own biological kids. He saw Malvo as controllable and moldable. Malvo would do anything that John asked him to do because his dependence on John was so strong. John vowed to get revenge on his ex-wife for taking his kids from him. He obsessively started to look for where she might be, eventually telling one of his friends that he thinks she might be in the Washington, D.C. area. In the back of his mind, he was already thinking up some really dark plans, and he returned to the Caribbean for a short time, where he grew a much stronger bond with Malvo. John brought Malvo to the United States and told him that he should enroll in the nearby Bellingham High School. Other students said that Malvo was quiet and polite, but it didn't seem like he was looking to make any friends. John, together with Malvo, had started to live with an old friend of his named Errol Dancy, since he didn't have anywhere else to go. Though John's friend recognised very early that something wasn't quite right with John. Dancy knew that John was going through a very rough patch, and that would make any normal man angry, but this felt like something else. This was something more. He noted that John had become manipulative and that Malvo had a lot of repressed anger, but Dancy tried not to dwell on this too much. After school, John took Malvo for his extracurricular activities, which is a totally normal thing for a kid to do. Except these extracurricular activities were at the shooting range. Every single day. John saw that Malvo was a natural marksman. One of the targets he had shot at almost had just a single hole where each of the bullets had gone through. And John said that he thought Malvo might even be a better shot than him. And remember, this is coming from the highly trained combat engineer who specialised in sniping. John went on to teach Malvo everything he knew about guns, including how to take them apart and maintain them. And to prove how much he had learned, during one of the classes in school, the teacher played the movie Platoon, which is a phenomenal movie, by the way. And when the teacher asked what weapons were being used in the movie, Malvo knew every single one of them, right down to the make and model. This freaked some of the other kids out because the quiet kid knowing a hell of a lot about firearms tends to make people a little bit nervous. At home, John encouraged Malvo to watch action movies and play video games that involved sniping. The more realistic, the better. It was thought that this was John's tactic to try and desensitize Malvo to the horrific reality of actually shooting someone. John also made sure that they both did a rigorous military exercise routine every morning, and they had a restricted diet of only one meal per day, which usually consisted of honey and crackers. Even with all of these signs, no one seemed to notice that John was clearly training Malvo for something. On February the 16th, 2002, which was 2 days before Malvo's birthday, John sent Malvo out on his first test. John hated one of his ex-wife's friends, a woman named Isa Nichols. So John thought that she would be the perfect target for Malvo to practice with. John sent Malvo out to her house without the knowledge that Isa's 21-year-old niece, Kenya Cook, would be there. And unfortunately, she would be the one to answer the door. Malvo shot her point blank in the face, firing one bullet and then making his escape. However, this was only the beginning of John's master plan. Sometime later, John stopped to visit his sister in Tucson, Arizona. She lived near a golf course, and shortly after arriving on March the 19th, 2002, a 60-year-old man named Jerry Taylor just so happened to be killed by a long-range shot to the chest while he was playing golf. John had actually told Malvo to do this as a training exercise. These early murders would mark the beginning of a killing spree orchestrated by John, and it would span from February until October of 2002. John and Malvo travelled around the United States through multiple states, robbing and killing anyone they wanted to. Then they finally arrived in the capital, Washington, D.C. However, murdering people right out in the open in the middle of a giant city is pretty much a guaranteed way of getting caught. So, how were they going to do it? Well, the men had concocted a plan for this. Early on the 3rd of October 2002, during heavy rush hour, John and Malvo were driving around in their blue 1990 Chevrolet Caprice looking for possible targets. Once they had found a target, one of them would keep watch in the driver's seat while the other would pull down the back seat of the car and slide into the boot, or the trunk for the Yanks. They would then line up the rifle with a small square hole that had been cut into the back of the car, which gave them a line of sight out into the street. Once the target was in their sights, they fired. The victim and everyone else in the street would have no idea where the shot had come from. This wasn't only due to the shooter being completely concealed by the car, but the inside of the boot had also been sprayed black to conceal the muzzle flash, and also the rifle being fired from inside the car also dulled the sound of the shot, though only by a little. People in the street would, of course, start running around and screaming because someone was just randomly shot dead right in front of them from fucking nowhere. Local cops in the area would even be trying to find a shooter, but because their sniper's nest was also their car, John and Malvo would just immediately drive away from the scene. One of the first victims was a 39-year-old landscaper named James Buchanan. He was minding his own business, mowing the grass at the side of the road, but little did he know, Malvo had his sights on him, and as soon as John gave the command to fire, Malvo did as he had been trained to do and pulled the trigger. After James was shot, the lawnmower just kept travelling as he rushed to find safety in a nearby car park. Unfortunately, the bullet had gone through his spine and his left shoulder blade. He collapsed in front of two nearby workers and was rushed to hospital, dying a few hours later. Apparently, because no one saw what actually happened, some witnesses thought that he had an accident with the lawnmower and that's what caused these wounds. Next, John and Malvo travelled to a nearby Mobile petrol station, parking across a large busy road. Using the same tactic as before, they shot a 54-year-old man called Premkumar Walekar. The .223 caliber bullet had been fired between two bushes and across 6 lanes of traffic, before tearing through his heart and his lung. The cashier at the petrol station immediately called the police in a panic, saying that a man had just been killed right in front of her and she had no idea who or where the gunman was. One of the customers at the scene was a doctor who tried to save Prem Kumar, but he was pretty much killed instantly. After a 25-minute drive scouting for more victims, John and Malvo spotted a 34-year-old woman named Sarah Ramos, who was quietly sitting on a bench and reading while she was waiting to be picked up by her boss. The generally peaceful moment she was having was cut short as she was shot from around 80 to 90 yards away. The bullet actually went through Sarah and then through the window behind her. She was killed instantly. Some people actually thought that she had shot herself since there was no one anywhere near her. An hour later, at another petrol station, a woman named Laurie Lewis was shot as she was cleaning out her car. And then, shortly afterwards, a 72-year-old man named Pascal Charlot was shot and killed as he crossed the street. Malvo and John then retired for the day and went home. The next day, they hopped back in the car and went out killing again. They would repeat this process every day for the next 23 days. Word got around about what was happening, and people were now terrified that a phantom gunman was on the loose and anyone could be the next target. The public became so scared that children were locked in their schools and asked not to go near any of the windows. And also, many public events were also cancelled. A lot of people didn't even want to leave their homes to go to the store, and they especially avoided petrol stations since they seemed to be the most common target. As John and Malvo got more confident, they actually got out of the car for some of the shootings. Obviously, this would have made them a lot more vulnerable to being spotted, but that was probably the point. The thrill of being seen by someone. John and Malvo set up the rifle in a car park just across from a Home Depot, where they spotted off-duty FBI analyst Linda Franklin and her husband, who were just about to load groceries into their car. Linda Franklin was hit in the left side of her head. The bullet had actually fragmented, which made it one of the more gory scenes that the police had to attend. The FBI has actually released pictures of all of the crime scenes that I'm talking about in this video, but this is YouTube, so I can't show you any of them. John and Malvo were starting to get very bold in their endeavours, and they even started leaving calling cards for the police. Some of them were really edgy, like the Death Tarot card. In other notes, they demanded $10 million in cash for them to stop the killings. Most of them had the quote, "Call me God," written on them. John and Malvo were also tracking the news about themselves. At one point, they were caught on camera at a restaurant, turning up the volume on the TV when a story about their killings came on. This is actually a pretty common thing for killers to do, since they want to see themselves with a successful amount of notoriety. Apparently, John and Malvo even went to some of the police press conferences where the officer was taking questions about the killings and what the police were doing to try and solve them. John and Malvo would even go back to their old crime scenes so that they could watch the police attempting to collect evidence. Then, once they had their jollies, they went back to killing. In Maryland, a 35-year-old bus driver named Conrad Johnson had been protecting the locals and the elderly in his community when they were all too scared to go out. He was a gentle giant that would walk people to his bus, actually shadowing them to make them feel safe, and he would also reassure them by saying that if anyone was going to get shot, it would be him since he was a bigger target. And unfortunately, That's what ended up happening. At 5:55 a.m. on October the 22nd, 2002, just as Conrad was preparing to do his daily route, he was shot through his liver from a nearby wooded area. Someone called the ambulance and stayed with him on the bus, and Conrad was rushed to hospital for emergency surgery. But unfortunately, he died during the operation. This would end up being the last murder that John and Malvo would commit. The police investigated every scene thoroughly, but they found no real evidence as to who was behind it. One of the things that made it very difficult for them was the killer didn't have a type or a pattern, like regular serial killers have. So this made it very hard to figure out a motive, and it also meant that the usual criminal profiling techniques just simply didn't work. And the fact that they were also a moving target made Malvo and John very hard to track down. Until 2 workers of a liquor store were shot and Malvo's fingerprints were found at the scene. And Malvo's fingerprints were in the system since he was earlier arrested in his life by border control because they thought he was an illegal alien. So now the cops had an identity. But they couldn't actually find him since he and John were always moving around. John's friend, Robert Holmes, who we talked about earlier on, had actually been following the shootings since they were pretty major news. And he became very suspicious since he knew that the killings would need a spotter and a shooter. Something that he knew John and Malvo had been training in. Plus, he knew that John was looking for his ex-wife and kids in that area. And John had also become a little bit mentally unhinged recently. So Robert put 2 and 2 together. Before Robert even got a chance to get in touch with the authorities actually called him first, since his address was the last known address of Malvo. And Robert told the authorities everything he knew about John and Malvo. The police immediately called a press conference, and the public were given information to help find the killers. The police gave out the license plate NDA21Z and said that the vehicle was a blue Chevy Caprice that had been legally registered in New Jersey under the name John Muhammad. The police asked people to call in immediately if they saw the car with that number plate. A Maryland trucker who was watching the news wrote down this plate, just in case he saw it. And then later that day, when the trucker was at a rest stop, he spotted the car parked nearby. He immediately contacted the police. At 3:30 a.m. on the 24th of October 2002, John and Malvo were sleeping in their car at a rest stop on the I-70 highway when suddenly they were completely surrounded by police, so quickly that they had no time to react. They were then immediately arrested. They had terrorised an entire state for nearly a whole month, killing 10 people and injuring 3 others during their sniper attacks, and they still had 14 other victims from previous attacks. Inside the vehicle, the police found a solar-charged laptop as well as maps which had circled areas where they planned to do more shootings, and also marks of where they had already killed people. They had pretty much done the police's job for them. In the boot of the car, the police saw the modifications that had been made to turn it into a mobile sniper's nest. And they also found the Bushmaster XM15 semi-automatic .223 rifle with an equipped holographic sight, which ballistic forensics confirmed was the gun used in most of the shootings. Most of the fingerprints they found were from Malvo, including on the calling cards and notes they had left the police. It seemed John had made Malvo do all of the killings and all of the grunt work, so his own DNA and fingerprints wouldn't be found anywhere. Most likely, he did this so that if they were ever caught, John could just blame everything on Malvo and use him as a scapegoat. Now we get on to the motive. Why did John do this? We know that all of this stemmed from him being angry over his wife leaving him and taking the kids. So did he do this out of rage? Was he getting back at society for what he felt society had done to him? Or had his Gulf War syndrome just simply drove him mad? Well, the problem is that even now, about 20 years later, we still don't actually know why he did this. Though there are some theories. One simple theory is that John was planning to bribe the government for money in exchange for stopping the killings, which is why he included a $10 million ransom in his calling cards. However, the most popular theory, and the one that I think might be true, is that during the rampage, John was planning to eventually kill his wife and have her mixed in with the other murders. This would mean that John wouldn't be immediately considered as a suspect, as most ex-husbands are whenever a woman is killed, since she would just be seen as one of the very, very many victims of a crazed gunman. Just another needle in a stack of bodies. So John would not only get revenge on her, but since she was dead, he would get his kids back. John and Malvo have never confirmed this, but this is the theory that I feel makes the most sense. After their arrest, Malvo was charged by the Commonwealth of Virginia for 2 capital crimes. One was for an act of terrorism due to the murder of FBI analyst Linda Franklin, and another for the murder of more than one person in a 3-year period. Malvo's charges meant that he was completely screwed, and he was handed 6 life sentences without the possibility of parole. However, in April of 2021, Maryland banned life sentences for juveniles. So Malvo sued them for relief, and the Maryland Court of Appeals agreed to review his case, and this review began in February of this year. Though Malvo's own lawyer believes that the possibility of him ever being granted parole is pretty much zero. However, a lot of people believe that Malvo himself was a victim. Malvo was groomed and taken advantage of by John, who exploited Malvo's obsession with finding a father figure, who he no doubt would have wanted to impress by doing whatever he was asked, even if he knew that what he was being asked to do was wrong. After they were caught, apparently Malvo's personality went from being like that of an indoctrinated soldier to just being a young boy again. And in later interviews with him, he said that he felt disgusted with himself and was extremely remorseful. He said that no apology was good enough. Though, after the things he has done, it's no surprise that most people struggle to believe anything he says. John chose to stay silent at all times after being caught, except for when he was in court, because he chose to defend himself. He must have known how screwed he was, since representing yourself is usually always a bad idea. Some people think that this was John's way of getting the last twist of the knife towards his victims, since he would be able to directly cross-examine their family members and even get to question some of the survivors of his attacks. It took some time for the witnesses to get used to being questioned by the man that tried to kill them, and some of them, as you would expect, got very emotional, either shitting themselves with fear or flying into a rage because they were forced to talk to the person who had killed their family members. Of course, Malvo and John were both eventually found guilty, except John's sentence was much harsher. Since he was the mastermind behind the whole thing, he was given the death penalty. On November the 10th, 2009, just a few hours before John was scheduled for execution, he made a plea for clemency to the governor. But his plea was denied. Before his execution by lethal injection, John refused to make a final statement. He didn't apologise, he didn't provide any explanation of why he did what he did, and he showed no remorse whatsoever for his actions. After he was pronounced dead, he was cremated and had his ashes handed to his son. Malvo will likely spend the rest of his days in prison, with every one of his appeals being shot down. I'm old enough to actually remember when all of this shit went down. And even people who weren't even from America or weren't even living in that area, they were all absolutely terrified of something like this happening. We all know to keep an eye out for dodgy people or dangers whenever we're out walking the streets, but what made this case so scary is there were no warnings, there were no signs, there was no visible danger that you could spot and then avoid. You could just be sitting there all alone, minding your own business, and then bang. Your entire life is over in a second. And you don't even get to know how it ended.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube. Everybody just subscribe.